Coming up on this week's show are Atari bringing back the worst mascot of the 90s.
Read comics on your Commodore 64.
And we go inside DMA Designs and Acclaim with Neill Glancy.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every Friday with our friends at Bitmap Books. Now, one of their books you absolutely need to check out, A Gremlin in the Works. If you enjoyed the games of the Sheffield-based publisher back in the day on the 8 and 16-bit platforms, check out this exhaustive history of the company, exclusive interviews and images, and lots more as well. And actually, you can save £5 if you order that book right now. You can check it out on the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. And with our friends at PCBWay. Now, if you're working on a retro project at the moment, they offer a fully featured custom PCB prototyping service with low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and they offer services like 3D printing and injection molding. And you know PCBWay are massive supporters of the retro community. So get an instant quote right now at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 375, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And very nice to have you joining us for our weekly look back at what's been happening in the world of retro gaming and technology from over the last week. And of course, plenty of nostalgia laid on for good measure as well. And in the second half of the podcast, I think that's when this show really comes into its own. When we welcome on a veteran of the industry to tell us their stories, find out about the games they worked on, the companies that they worked for back in the day as well. And this week, I know we've done so many interviews on this podcast over the last 7.5 years, but this one, I think, definitely stands out as a glowing example of why we do this show. Don't you think, Joe?
Oh, God, absolutely. So we had Neill Glancy on this week. Me and Dan interviewed him, and it felt really good getting somebody on who worked a lot with the N64. That was kind of like what I was drooling over. He worked on some really legendary games on the N64, Turok games, the South Park games. But I think what really got Dan going is he was actually the lead developer on Walker 2, which unfortunately never came out, and he was involved in the original Walker for Amiga as well, which was really fascinating to hear about, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, these games were obviously legendary titles, and Neill worked for some massive companies. I mean, he started back in 1985 as a pixel artist, an animator and a designer. Then he went to work for DMA Design, and you're right, I think the first project he worked on there was Walker, which, have you played Walker before, Ravi? It's quite a unique game, isn't it?
It was one of my favourite Amiga titles. It was very unique, and even just the direction of your Walker, going from the right to the left of the screen. The idea of going through history and also killing all those like little pixel people was always very satisfying.
Yeah, because you play basically a massive mech, and yeah, you've got to control it. It's quite interesting controls as well, because I remember you used the mouse and the joystick on that game.
Yeah. To
control the Walker, which I'd never seen anything like that before as well. Got great reviews back in the day, and then, as you mentioned, Joe, we went on to work on Walker 2, that was the cancelled sequel to that game. Although you'll hear in the interview that Neill reckons he might still have some floppy disks of it in his mum's attic. So I'm going to have a little chat to him on email and just see if he wants to get someone with an Amiga to archive them for him. I'm looking over at my Amiga.
You did offer, didn't you, Dan? And he did say, you know what? He was like, next time I'm over there, he was like, I might have a look and send them you. So that would be an incredible story. But yeah, it was an incredible interview, not to take away from that.
Yeah, he went to Acclaim after that as well. He mentioned those South Park games, and they had such a troubled development history that you hear all about as well. Then he worked for Midway afterwards as well, even moving into, virtual reality games in more recent years too. So a hell of a lot to pack into this week's interview, but an absolute legend. Neill Glancy is going to be our special guest on the show in around 35 minutes from now. Now, I always try and estimate how long the news is going to take, because we always inevitably end up waffling on a bit more than we expect to, but, he's coming up in the second half.
A lot of people say to us that the Retro Hour is more than an hour, and I say it's like Poundland. You go into Poundland and not everything's a pound anymore. Some of it's increased to £5. So, yeah, it's kind of like that.
And to be fair, the retro 1 hour, 27 minutes doesn't have quite the same ring to it, I don't think, does it? So, Neill is on very soon, though. Before that, we do like to update you on what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last week. And I saw a lot of people posted this story in our Discord. And we do have a Discord server for the podcast that you can hop on. Everyone's welcome on there. And there is actually a channel in there where people can submit news. And I saw Gareth submitted this one. Ash did as well. And this story's been everywhere. That Atari have acquired more than 100 retro computer and console titles from the 80s and 90s. And this includes stuff like, the Demolition Racer franchises, Hardball as well. But the one that most people seem to be talking about...
I knew I should have taken that left turn at Uranus! Was it something I said? What could possibly go wrong?
Dan's favourite title.
Bubsy could be coming back.
Yes. Oh, sorry.
I'm not sure how I feel about this, because I must admit, I don't mind the Bubsy game on the Atari Jaguar. It is solid. I mean, really difficult. It's actually my wife's favourite game on the Atari Jaguar, and if I've got it set up, she'll be like, oh, stick Bubsy on. She managed to get to level 2 once on it, but I think even I watched James and Mike Mondays, that James Rolfe does and Mike Matei, they couldn't get that far. So my wife's actually better at Bubsy than the Angry Video Game Nerd, which I think, is quite an accolade.
You know what? I had Bubsy for the Mega Drive, and I never had an issue with it as a kid. I had issues with the difficulty, but I never had issues with the game itself. And now, people kind of bash it and stuff. And I think it's just because of Bubsy 3D was so bad. I think people then just assumed the entire series was bad. Whereas I don't have much of an issue with it. So I'm quite happy to see him come back, to be honest. Well, potentially come back.
So all of these titles are going to be coming to the Atari VCS, right?
I assume so. I mean, they're still kind of pressing on with the VCS.
I was like, oh, mate.
No, try to say it with a bit of sarcasm.
They brought that Atari 50 collection out recently on the Atari VCS.
Yeah, so, maybe.
They are still persevering on. Apparently, they've had quite a big price cut on the console in North America, I've been reading. So they're actually available, more affordable than they were originally. But it does seem interesting that Atari, it looks like they're really going down, pushing this retro thing, which makes sense for them as well. Yeah,
it's interesting. They're talking about the games here, and there's a quote from Wade Rosen, who's the CEO at the moment, and he's saying that fans can look forward to seeing many of these titles re-released in physical and digital forms, in some cases even ported to modern consoles, which is really interesting. And then also, it looks like they've acquired Night Dive Studios as well, and that's really interesting because Night Dive Studios are the guys that have been, redoing a lot of these titles, remastering some of the old retro ones. So they've also been improving the quality of them. So it looks like that kind of technology for the remastering process and the way that Night Dive do it, Atari may have a hand in that. And then they can take a lot of these kind of older titles that they've acquired, over 100 PC and console titles, also their old Atari catalogue, and then kind of redo it with, Night Dive technology and, re-release. And I wonder what kind of service this is going to go on to, because I knew that there was a cloud service, wasn't there, for the VCS?
Yeah, it's like a store, I think. Yeah, I mean, I've got a VCS, must admit I haven't used it in about a year. Might be a good reason to get it set up again and kind of look at what they're doing on there. But I know they did do those physical cartridge releases, didn't they, a couple of years ago as well?
Yes,
of a bunch of 2600 games as well. So it is something Atari have kind of done in recent years. But interesting that they picked up all these classic... I mean, these games originally were owned by Acclaim, Infogram, and Microprose. So basically, it's some of their back catalogue that they've bought, and also a few flight sims as well. 1942 Pacific Air War, F117A and F14 as titles now that they've bought in their catalogue. So yeah, it's an interesting range that they've bought there as well. But I think everyone does seem to be focusing on Bubsy, and I think you're right, Joe. I think in terms of a bog standard kind of mid-90s platformer, it wasn't too out there. I mean, I found the voice acting a little bit annoying sometimes.
Oh, you can't say that. We've had her on.
I think she would actually admit it. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
We did. I forgot. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't. I mean, it was like Gex as well. It was that mid 90s kind of Tude era, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where, they just come out with these corny phrases and stuff, which does great a bit sometimes.
Interesting to see the list of all of these coming out. The final list of all the titles that they've acquired, because I'm sure there's going to be something a bit more kind of headline grabbing than Bubsy. But there also seems to be like an effort in there to do new adaptations on past storylines as well. So maybe there could be some continuations, and if they've got the rights to these characters, they could maybe put them in new games. Maybe there could be a huge kind of Smash Bros style game that has Bubsy included.
Bubsy was meant to be a cartoon back in the 90s. And I think they made like a pilot, didn't they? And then it got cancelled. Maybe they're looking at the success of the Sonic and Mario movies, thinking, right, we need a movie character. It could be like Bubsy, the movie coming to a cinema near you. Before
You wish.
Oh, God. Yeah, Dan does wish. Can you imagine that? That'd be the next big video game flop, like movie flop.
I think he's due a comeback.
I think they'll be able to do anything with this. Once you've got the rights, you'll be able to do T-shirts, you'll be able to do all sorts of kind of different things, even outside the... just re-releasing the title and putting it out there.
Well, I, for one, welcome back, Bubsy. All is forgiven. So we'll keep an eye on that story and keep you updated. Now, something that looks very good, and it does seem to be, one of the go-to platforms for homebrew developments over the last few years, the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis is getting what looks like a very cool fighting game. Now, this is, when I say fighting game, it's more in the vein of something like Street Fighter 2, not Streets of Rage. It's not like a brawler, is it? This is a one-on-one fighting game.
Yeah, so like you say, I always kind of see Streets of Rage, those kind of belt-scrolling fighting games. They're beat-em-ups, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat. They're fighting games. That's how I've always kind of see it. I could be wrong in terms of the terminology there and stuff like that. Obviously, everybody's got their own ideas about it. But as you say, this is going to be go for it for the Sega Mega Drive and the Sega Genesis, which I really, really like the look of this. It looks just like a really polished Mega Drive game from what I've seen so far. And it looks very much kind of in the vein of, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Eternal Champions or Saturday Night Slam Masters, which were both on the Mega Drive and really, really fun games. Really kind of reminds me of that kind of like a superhero kind of bright look to it, but kind of like a wrestling WWF kind of over the top, like 90s vibe to it, which I really like the look of. A lot of the characters are wearing like roller skates, and the Mexican, is it Machador? I can't remember how you say it. The masks they wear and stuff like that. It looks really, really cool, and it's being brought to us by a video game company called I Heart Pizza Video. And the guy behind that company is a guy called John Springer. And one of the reasons it's kind of building up a lot of hype is he's actually putting out quite a lot of videos, which look really, really cool, of him kind of like hyping the game and saying it's coming in 2023.
Well, that is the thing. I mean, I've actually got a clip here of one of his tweets where you can see the game running on a CRT behind him. Just small in the background, but if you want to see kind of the motion of it, I'll link that up so people can check it out. And you did use probably the optimal word there, hype. He does sound like such a good hype man. Listen to the enthusiasm, and he explains the story about why the Mega Drive / Genesis is so important to him as well. I really like this.
It takes a lot of nerve to try and create an all-time classic fighting game. That's exactly what we're going to do. And you know why? Because when I was a kid, I grew up with the Sega Genesis. I never fit in, but that console brought me joy in some of my hardest times when I was lonely, when I had stage 4B cancer. And I want to pay that forward forever and introduce a whole new generation locally and beyond to my favorite gaming console of all time. I love Fort Wayne. I love the Sega Genesis. I heart pizza. And we're going to go for it. We're going to go for it. We're going to go for it.
Now that is enthusiasm.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And, there's a sentiment there as well, which I didn't even realize. So, I love the name and the kind of the fighting spirit behind it as well now.
That's the thing. I mean, obviously the Mega Drive is a really important system to him. And the fact that, that these games just feel so at home on the Mega Drive, don't they? So I think it looks really good. And apparently it's going to be out before the end of this year. So looking at the footage, I mean, it does look kind of like it's in a pretty decent running state so far. I mean, the only thing he's kind of put out there front of center that I've seen so far is screenshots of it. But like I said, there is kind of a few videos where you can see it running in the background.
Yeah, so looking at a 2023 release, fingers crossed, for a physical release as well. And then he's not specified what consoles, but it said it will be coming to some modern consoles. I imagine, I've said this before, it seems to be easier to get these kind of games on the Switch and the PS4 than it is like Xbox. But it'll be really cool if we see it on kind of like, all free and Steam as well. But yeah, one definitely to keep our eyes out for.
That would definitely feel very at home on the Switch as well, actually. So look forward to seeing that. So another one we'll keep an eye on. And if you want to check out what we know so far, I'll put that in our show notes as well on your podcast app and at theretrohour.com. Now, Ravi was practically salivating over this next story. You're a comic book fan, aren't you?
I'm
all three of us, you're probably the biggest
comic book fan. Yeah, so I've got tech magazines up on my kind of shelf here, and then I've also got comic books, and I've got boxes of comics. I used to be really into them, graphic novels, all of that, and seeing a comic book reader is a good thing because a lot of people consume them in different ways, especially with like tablets as well. It's really nice to have comic book readers, but seeing one on the Commodore 64 is something very special. And the thing about this is it actually works, and it works well. I'm pretty amazed with this technology. Now, I'm not that familiar with the C64, but what this is it's a guy called Jan Dirogi, and it's basically called Slipstream. And the whole idea of it is that it's a comic book reader, but it actually streams it off the tape. And I'm just amazed with this. You're a C64 guy, Dan, aren't you? What do you think of this?
Yeah, and I think you made a good point there. And that is the most impressive aspect of this for me. And there is a video that you can watch. Quite an interesting video. The whole video is read out on an AI voice, even though it's nicely edited and he kind of shows stuff as well, but there's like an AI voice that kind of reads out most of the video. You do get used to it pretty quick.
It's the future,
but yeah,
Dan, you will get used to it.
I'll be doing the podcast next month, isn't it?
AI Dan.
Yeah, I mean, it basically runs on a stock Commodore 64. And when I first read that, I was like, well, how has he managed to fit an entire comic book? Because, I mean, some of these are like, knocking on for nearly 100 pages by the looks of this video. And he stores them all on like a long cassette tape. And I thought, well, the Commodore 64's only got 64K of RAM. So how on earth does it store all that in there? But it turns out it basically uses, if you ever played kind of multi-load games on the Commodore 64 back in the day. So what you do is you'd have a level of like, I think International Karate did that. So you beat one level and then it would load the next level off tape.
Yeah. So essentially it's like it's buffering it, but like just
it's doing it in real time.
A little bit ahead,
Yeah, so what this does, basically it is streaming a continuous stream of data from the cassette and showing it on screen. So that means that what you're seeing on the screen is about 6 seconds behind what's loading off the tape. Very interestingly, if you want to read something on the screen, you can just pause a cassette tape and it stops.
Yeah,
or if you want to skip forward a bit, you can rewind it or fast forward the tape.
And the way that it scrolls as well is it kind of scrolls across the screen. So as you're leaving one of the comic book scenes, it scrolls across, and then the other one's loading in a buffered style, and then it just comes in. Which adds this kind of consistency and this flow of reading it that's really nice. And he's thought of lots of little clever kind of hacks in there. So he's not got any of the speech bubbles in comics because that's going to be quite hard with the kind of low definition that you're getting on the screen. I think it's about half the size of the screen, the actual definition of the picture, the actual resolution that they can have it at. But he's got the subtitles in there. But the cool thing about that is when you do it, you can have 2 languages as well. So it's storing subtitles. You could have English and you could have Dutch or German or whatever. And then one comic suddenly becomes a thing for 2 audiences, which I really like. And he's developed a really nice little program that, I don't have a C64. I've never kind of got one working. But as a comic fan, I've got some favorite comics and I want to put them through this little program to create, little tapes that people can then have that actually have the comic strips in. And the way that you put it in is you kind of have the tape length, you create these scenes, but also it has a preview of what the image will look like on the C64. So you can play around with the contrast, and it's just so geeky. I absolutely love it.
And that is a really good thing that he's doing, because you can actually download this Stripstream software. It's hard to say that.
I think I was saying Slipstream earlier, so yeah, I'm glad you've
Stripstream, like comic strips. Yeah. And it's a ready-to-run program file as well. There's also a couple of example projects in this tape image format that he's got on there. There's the editor program. There's even a manual that he's put together as well, and also instructions on basically how people can put together their own tapes as well. That they, he actually shows a few in this video here that look like, professionally printed cassette tapes with the inlay and everything as well. So yeah, I mean, very niche, very geeky, but extremely cool. And looking at some of these as well, I mean, one cool thing is when it's loading, it actually tells you how many pages are in the comic. And one of the examples in the video is actually 300 pages.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how your eyes would feel after reading a 300-page comic on a Commodore 64
Well,
with a
next
CRT.
you need to get the voice synthesis to actually do like a voiceover on top of it. And then you could watch the images go by and have that would be really cool. And different tones for different characters, like a high one, a low one. But maybe that would take up too much data. I also love the fact that you can print it off, even though you are degrading the quality massively, and then you're kind of putting it through, a dot matrix printer. It's still like, that's cool. I could duplicate it,
You did have a Commodore 64 at one stage. Did you get rid of it then?
I gave up. I couldn't. I'm a GUI guy. I'm sorry. I'm a GUI guy. Maybe I should have put that new operating system on it.
Or GEOS. There's an old school GUI for the Commodore 64.
It's in
GEOS.
it's in the cupboard, so maybe I should clean it off and get it out.
Well, this is a good excuse to get it loaded up again.
Totally. I would just fill it with Judge Dredd. That would be 2000 AD. Just be producing tap files for that.
It's amazing, isn't it, that nothing like this, because, you see projects like this and you think that would have made a commercial product back in the day.
100%.
100%.
And I've seen stuff for higher end stuff. And this, sometimes you see these proof of concepts and then you see something that actually works and is like a full kind of product. And this is like a one man kind of product because it's so well thought out, the whole thing.
Yeah, real passion project. So top work on that. If you want to download that, it is available now. And of course, I'll stick that in the show notes too. Now, this is very cool. This is a new puzzle platformer game that's been in development for about 8 years now that's finally come out this week on the PC. But it is very retro inspired. The graphics on this look straight out of the mid kind of 1990s. This is a game called Moon of Darsalon.
I'm so glad that you read that, Dan, because I was talking to Dan about this before we started recording, and I couldn't say it. So this looks really interesting. So in terms of like a visualization, I guess kind of like maybe like Abe's Odyssey in terms of the visuals. It's 3D models mixed with pixel art, and
looks early PlayStation to me.
To me, it looks. It doesn't look PlayStation. To me, it looks like System Freeze games that they did at one period. So like Constructor and this kind of, at least the 3D elements of it.
It reminds me...
got that kind of comic-y rendered roundness about them.
The Silicon Knights, kind of like, Killer Instinct as well. Donkey Kong Country, what Rare did. But then...
Yeah, actually, it has got a bit of the kind of Silicon Graphics render vibe as well, but also like bad PD games as well.
Yeah,
at the time.
Yeah, and obviously it's a very purposeful look, and I think it really suits it, and it's not a look you see very often. So it's made by Dr. Cuco Games, which is a Spanish developer, and as you say, Dan, it's been in development for 8 years now, and it's been completely solo developed by this one guy, Dr. Cuco.
It's kind of a mix of 3D and 2D as well. Like some of the aspects of it are flat, and then some of them are really rounded and rendered.
Yeah. Like I say, 3D models mixed with the pixel art. So, in terms of gameplay, at first, the reason I say Abe's Odyssey is because I thought it was that kind of style, like command based, because of the idea of it is you're an astronaut looking for your lost squad members, and you kind of shout, go left, go right, directions at them like you do in Abe's Odyssey, and you have to save them.
Voice commands.
Not voice commands. I don't. No,
yeah, it has.
Oh, is it voice commands? Is it? Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
It's saying voice commands to control companion NPCs.
Oh, okay. So you literally shout at them. Oh, okay, that's really cool. So I was thinking, like Abe's Odyssey, but then when you watch the trailer, it's a little bit more like Metal Slug meets Lemmings. Is the only way I can describe it.
That's a great description.
I think you're right, but I also think Broforce meets Worms.
Yeah. There's
a lot of worms in there visually. I was looking at that, and a lot of the levels remind me of worms.
Yeah, and the way that there's this certain gun in there where you can build environments, so you can actually, which is well Earthworm Jimmy, like you can destroy it as well, but you can actually like put soil sections down and like block off certain areas or build ramps up. It's got an element of destructibility.
Yeah, that like you say, the gun that makes like bridges and stuff, that really reminded me of the bridge building Lemming, but then you can shoot it away as well, and and then it's there is loads of enemies and like little spaceships you can get in and stuff like that. And if you actually kind of read into it, it's actually a sequel to a game called Pilots of is it Darsalon? Is it Darsalon?
Yeah. Well done. Yeah.
It's actually a sequel to that game, which was a completely different. It's got a very similar art style, but it's a completely different game. It's I forget kind of the genre, but it's when you pilot a spaceship, but you have to kind of land it. There's I can't remember what the game it's based on from like the 80s, but when you have like a certain amount of fuel and you have to like really gently land the ship and stuff like that. It's a sequel to one of them games. So I think it's really interesting. It's kind of like you've landed the ship, and now you've got to run around on this planet and you've got to save all your astronaut friends, which I really like the idea of.
Which kind of has the Pikmin kind of chaos.
Yeah, it does.
And they're just still running around,
Yeah, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of influence in this game from, a load of different genres as well. But yeah, I just love the way it looks, and I think, they've done a really good job of kind of staying faithful to that. Like I said, to me, it kind of reminds me of like very early PlayStation, where you've got the 2D sprites and the 3D models and stuff in there too. There's also 8-bit music that's based on the SID chip from the Commodore 64.
Oh, that's cool.
In there as well, SID-style music, 8-bit speech synthesis as well. Although in other ways, it's got stuff like realistic liquid physics and, the vehicle physics look really good in it too. So it's kind of that, bridges modern comforts and retro quite well, I think.
Yeah, I like this. It's not like strictly recreating one genre. It's like a mashup of everything. And yeah, that's creating something new, which is really nice.
Yeah, and there's a free demo that you can download from Steam if you want to try it out. And if you want to buy the full game, it's only £16.67. So not going to break the bank. But yeah, it looks really good. It's nice to see, we always do our bit to try and support these indie games that are doing a really good job. So definitely worth getting on that and checking it out. Even download the free demo, give it a try this weekend. And if you like it, buy the full game. It looks really, really cool. Now, something that I do want to buy, and I said to the lads before, I said, do you think anyone else would be interested in this? They said, no, probably not. But I thought I'd talk about it anyway. This is
to get people interested.
Well, that's the thing, because this is not going to happen unless people want it. Now, this is a ODE, an optical, what's that ODE stand for? Is that optical drive
emulator,
enhanced or emulator? That's it, makes sense. So this is basically a flash solution to replace an optical drive. And we've seen these on other platforms as well. We've seen it on the Sega Saturn, got one recently, didn't it? You can get them for the PlayStation as well. Admittedly, this platform is slightly more niche. This is someone who wants to make one for the Philips CDI. Now, this is a guy called Felix, and he's done a few of these before, but basically, unless there's enough interest in there, he's not going to go ahead and make it. And it did make me kind of think, because I was looking through randomly. I downloaded like a bunch of old gaming mags off archive.org the other day, and I've been playing around my CD32 this week. And it's remarkable to look at, the amount of games that were promised on certain platforms that obviously weren't a success, like the CD32, and never got released. And there's a really cool dinosaur game, which I can't remember the title off the top of my head now. And I was looking at screenshots of it thinking, it would be awesome if that came out. And then I learned that it actually did get a release on the Philips CDI. So I thought, I have to get the CDI set up again. And it turns out mine's not reading discs anymore.
Yes.
So
this is ideal, because these things are great for actually like kind of saving the original hardware. If you've got an issue like that, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare to repair. It's interesting seeing what he's kind of aimed for. So he's got an interest list here. And I don't know what the DVC slot is, but apparently you can extend it. So the SD card can be extended via the DVC slot. So
that's a digital video cartridge slot. So there's an expansion slot on the back where you normally put an FMV card in there.
So I guess you'll be able to slot it into the back. And they're saying, there's going to be a way of working with redump as well, which is a way of dumping your images. And, it will have storage transfer in RAM as well, and micro SD supported as storage. So it sounds like quite a good project. It's fitting on this kind of area. It does say it will require soldering 11 to
that's the thing. The CDI doesn't have a connector for the optical drive. It's just soldered to the board.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
So it doesn't mean you have to unsolder the old one and solder it on. But I mean, from memory, they're only kind of like small little cables. It shouldn't be that tricky. I think even I could probably do that.
Yeah.
So, but at the moment, this is not pre-orders, but he's just wants to gauge the interest for it, really, to see if people want this. And if they do, then you'll get a notification when the product's available. So at the moment, there's a little Google Docs form that you can fill in if you've got a CDI and you want a new optical drive replacement. Because I'm looking around at my machines, pretty much all of my retro machines. I mean, one or two of them have got old school hard disks in, but more of them these days have either EverDrives or flash carts or compact flash adapters. I mean, I pretty much use them in everything now. So, these are available on loads of other platforms. And I remember for ages really wanting one for the Atari Jaguar, and, the Crix and Maxi EverDrives was like, there's not enough of a market there to bother doing it. Then obviously there was one made for it recently by Retro HQ. So I think, it does seem now that all the mainstream platforms are covered in terms of SD card readers. So all that's left is these kind of weird, obscure formats that only like 5 or 6 people like.
But I also guess like the CDI was a standard, right? So there were lots of different versions of the CDI as well. So in this form, he's got like, let me know your CDI that you're actually using, because I guess it's going to be a bit of a harder job to get compatibility with all of the different versions of the CDI in there, as opposed to something like, that's very common that people are just doing one that, fits all of them because they know what's in that device.
So, I mean, if you have got a CDI, lurking in the attic, or maybe, you regularly dig out your CDI to, play Space Quest on it, or try and control Lemmings with that horrible remote control. The thing is, I just think all of these retro platforms should have something like this. Of course, I mean, as I've found out, optical drives don't last forever. I'm going to try cleaning mine and it might bring it back to life. But
loading times are better as well.
Well, that's the thing, and it's more stable and it's easier to get stuff on there as well. I mean, I don't know if you guys, burnt a CD recently, but, it just seemed to me like, the actual CDs that you buy in places like Asda, they do those little towers of like 50 discs. It feels like the quality of those is nowhere near as good as it used to be.
Do you think if you asked a kid about burning a CD these days, they'd understand?
I saw very depressingly, someone actually tweeted that a couple of months ago. I saw that pop up on my timeline. It was like, oh, can someone explain to me, I'm 14. What does burning a CD make? How do you actually burn it? What's that mean? And I was like, God.
You get a CD.
To me, it still feels...
You get a lighter.
Yeah, it's going to be a lost art soon, so we need to replace these old optical drives. So if you have any interest for it, or you just think another system deserves an SD card reader, there is a little form that I'll link up in the show notes as well. So you can check that out. And all the rest of the stories, you don't have to Google around. I put them all in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, it's Friday when the show comes out, and actually, I will post this on Patreon and our socials beforehand as well, because Friday night, it's going to be party night with the boys tonight, isn't it?
Party night on a Friday night. Trying it out.
What?
Yeah, we've got to trying it out, aren't we?
So if you want to hang out with us, we normally do our patrons hangout on the last Sunday of the month. But we keep an eye on Discord, and we do have people contacting us on Twitter. And we've always done it on a Sunday. But I've seen a few messages of people saying, Sundays don't work for me. I've got to work then, or I've got family commitments as well. So I thought we'd try swapping it up a little bit and actually doing it on a Friday night instead. So we're going to be doing our monthly patrons hangout today when the show comes out, Friday the 28th of April at 8 o'clock this evening, 8 p.m. till 10. I imagine being a Friday night, there might be a kind of to a cider by Joe's side, possibly being a Friday.
Possibly.
Is it before a bank holiday weekend as well? By week?
There's definitely one coming. I think it might be next weekend.
I was going to say, I don't think so.
There's so many, I don't know what's going on these days.
Well, the King's Coronation's a weekend after, but we could treat it as a bit of a warm-up. There's a couple of bank holiday weekends in May. I'm sure we'll all be in the party mood. But if you haven't joined us for one before, basically, if your back is on Patreon, you get an invite to come to the Patrons Hangouts that we do once a month. Basically, just a massive Zoom call. Load of us get on, we geek out, sharp pickups. It's just a bit of fun, really, isn't it? And some helpful advice on there as well, though. We often get tips and stuff as well. So we always say it's a bit like a virtual users group. So if you join us on Patreon this weekend, you'll get an invite to that. That's coming up tonight. And also, we're going to be recording our next episode of the Retro Hour After Hours. Now, this is a little bonus podcast that we do every single month.
Yeah, it's really good fun. I kind of like the freedom of the Retro Hour After Hours, because it's like pick a subject and then we just get really in depth on that. And on the podcast, it's great. We have guests on and we talk about their kind of life and stuff. But it's good to delve into those certain subjects and just get really deep in it. And I kind of, you know, we're all nerds here, and we just really love kind of discussing it. And there's so many episodes now that if you sign up as a patron, you can get a huge kind of back catalogue of all of the After Hours episodes.
Yeah, I think it's like 34 that you'll unlock if you join us this weekend. And the new episode we're going to be recording on Sunday is going to be about our favourite co-op games. And Joe and I were talking about this the other day, and Joe said, you know, I'm not going to pick the usual ones. You know, Streets of Rage is not going to be in there. We're going to think a bit more outside the box, aren't we?
Yeah, so we're going to go for our kind of like favourite co-op games, but I kind of had the realisation of a lot of the games I've covered in the After Hours are co-op games. And a lot of the games I've mentioned in my time on the Retro Hour, you know, my favourite games of all time and stuff like that, a lot of them are co-op games. So I'm going to think a little bit outside the box with my list. You guys don't have to do this at all, but I'm going to think and try and recommend some co-op games that some people might not have played too much or heard of, which are, you know, really, really good kind of couch co-op experiences, which is something we don't get too often these days. So I'm really, really looking forward to recording that one.
Did the supermarket co-op, did they sell games at any point? Maybe I could just mention those.
Yeah, Ravi's just going to do games that he bought in the co-op back in the day. I think you've misunderstood the brief a bit there. But yeah, I mean, if you'd like to join us on Patreon, very good time to do it this weekend. And all the details to sign up are on our website at theretrohour.com. Right, then next, we're going to go inside the world of DMA Design and Acclaim with this week's very special guest. Neill Glancy is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it's time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And I'm so excited to get some stories about legendary companies like DMA Design, Iguana Entertainment, Acclaim Studios, Midway as well, with our special guest this week, Neill Glancy. How's it going, Neill?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, very good, thanks. And thank you so much for taking a bit of time to reminisce with us on the podcast this week. And before we get into, you know, some of these incredible titles that you've worked on in your career so far, just to kind of wind it right back to day one for a bit of context. I mean, what was your first gaming experience then? Do you remember what initially got you interested in video games in the first place?
I think like many people of my generation, you know, back then it was the early, you know, coin-op arcades, you know, playing Space Invaders, and then, you know, the Atari 2600 console system, you know, having games that you could play at home on your TV, and just as a child being sort of curious as to, these things are really fun, but how do they work? You know, how could I make one, that kind of thing.
So you used a lot of tools such as like OCP Art Studio on like, you know, your early home systems to make art projects. What kind of artwork were you creating? And do you have much of an artistic flair at school? Did you have much of an art background, or did you just kind of fall into it with like computers and stuff?
I've always been very artistic and very interested in art. A lot of the games projects that I've been involved in throughout my career, I've involved creating a lot of illustrations and diagrams and things. But yes, as you're correct, I used OCP Art Studio in some of the early works. Those were mainly things focusing on Spectrum titles, and then later Atari ST and Amiga, with things like Deluxe Paint as well. But initially, I spent several years working with the tools, just doing experiments, trying to understand, you know, what the tools could do, what they couldn't do. There was really a major sort of generational shift in what could be done with the tools from the Spectrum to, you know, the Atari ST and Amiga. With the Atari ST and Amiga, the pixels could be discrete colors, you know, whereas with the Spectrum, because it used kind of color cells that bled into other kind of color cells, they were very limited in how you could embed color into a sprite. But I spent many years just trying to kind of understand how the tools worked, and kind of initially trying to kind of mimic nature, you know, looking at things like water effects or the behavior, movement of, say, wheat in a field when it's being blown, and how could you kind of capture all of that movement with all those kind of fibers and threads moving at once. And there were certain sort of animation brush techniques you could use to kind of mimic very complex behaviors like that. And then I would usually also try to kind of mimic things I was seeing in the gaming world, you know, in the coin-op industry, in terms of creating sprites that had lots of pack detail in them, and, you know, shadow information, possibly some lighting information, you know, things of that sort.
Well, when it got to the mid to late 80s, you started sending out your work to studios to find employment. So who were you kind of sending them to then? Were you just basically sending floppy disks out in the post? And obviously you got involved with Rainbird as well. Kind of tell us the story there.
Yeah, and it's funny to think that that's kind of the way it works, but it did work like that. It did involve going to the post office with a floppy disk and putting it in a Ziploc bag and crossing your fingers that it would get there in one piece.
Different time.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, totally pre-internet. At the time, in the back of fan magazines, there would be adverts from game developers, publishers seeking talent. So I basically just, replied to a few of these ads and put my portfolio on a disc and sent it to them. And I was like, well, maybe I'll hear something back, maybe not, who knows, who can say. And, weeks and weeks would pass. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, Rainbird, who were one of the groups that I'd sent work to, reached out to me and they were like, hey, we got your disc. We really like what we're seeing on this disc. We'd like to pair you with a programmer who's working on a project that's fairly far along, but he needs, a whole suite of graphics for this project in terms of character designs and animations, as well as environmental assets, because back then levels were made of little sprite mosaic tiles, so you kind of laid these tiles down to build a level out, kind of like a mosaic. So all of those pieces for the game had to be created as well.
So did that lead to you joining DMA Design in 1990, or was there kind of like a few years period where you were kind of like working for yourself, working for Rainbird? What's the story there, and how did you end up at DMA?
Yes, a little bit of the latter. I worked sort of for myself and for Rainbird on a few different projects. Having worked on one of the first projects with them, which was a game called First Contact for the Amiga, it was almost the world's first real-time strategy game. I think it was the second one ever to be made. We were just put to the post by Herzog Zwei from the Genesis. But once I'd done that work on that project, there was other things that Rainbird needed for other games. So they're like, hey, can you help out on this other game over here, or do this thing on this other game over here? And some of those deals were attractive and interesting, and some of the deals were not particularly attractive or interesting from a financial standpoint, or they were conversions. They were like, hey, instead of, making graphics from this game, can you convert the graphics from this game to the Spectrum, for example, which was less interesting work to me because, obviously you're not being creative there. You're just kind of, porting something that someone else has made. But to get to your question about DMA, at the time I was also working at a computer shop in Edinburgh, which sold computers and video games. And I would do graphics kind of in my evenings. And one of the customers that came into the shop was this chap called Ian Dunlop. And Ian was the lead programmer on Walker at DMA. And, we just kind of got to chatting. When he was in the store one day, he would usually come in to buy games and things. We'd be chatting about them. And he was talking about the work he was doing on Walker. And I was telling him that I was kind of in between assignments for Rainbird. And he's like, well, hey, maybe we could, work together in some way, shape or form. And I was like, yeah, that'd be great, because this is a good time for me. I'm kind of in between things. So he showed me some of the early work he'd done on Walker, and it was pretty clear to me that there was a lot that could be done there that wasn't being done. So I went away and spent the next, maybe 4 or 5 months working on a total set of kind of replacement graphics. Yeah. So kind of one entire set of background graphics, completely overhauled new character graphics, all new particle effects, in terms of explosions and bullet impacts and, blood and gore effects and, things like that. And then gave them back to Ian, and he spent, I guess, a couple of weeks putting them in the game. And he was super happy with what I delivered. And then I think he was due to go up to Dundee to speak to Dave Jones to show him a milestone or something. And he took that build up with him to show DMA his progress and also these new graphics. And they were pretty blown away with the changes. And so Dave Jones reached out and he's like, hey, we should meet, we should talk. This is some really compelling work. Would you be willing to relocate to Dundee? And so that's kind of how all that ball of wax got started.
Well, Walker had some really impressive graphics for the time. I was a massive fan of that game when it came out. I mean, what was kind of your inspiration for the art style of Walker then?
That's a great question. At the time, I would say probably the strongest inspiration for the art was Akira, the sort of seminal Japanese anime set in Tokyo with, Tetsuo and Kaneda and all these people. Some of the characteristics of that work, obviously, were that it was incredibly detailed. It had extremely detailed observations around light and shadow. There's a lot of scenes in Akira which have, really beautiful light and shadow work. And that was one of the things that I really wanted to kind of achieve in Walker, was a next generation level of lighting. Unfortunately, none of that work is actually in the retail product. So none of the work or very little of the work that I did for Walker actually shipped in the game, and which is another kind of bizarre story. And the reason for that is that although David Jones was very much a fan of the work that I had done for Walker and that Ian had integrated into the game was very far along in production. They had an art team up in Dundee who'd been working on the game for quite some time, I believe maybe almost a year. And Dave's take on it was, we can't put your stuff in the game because it's a completely different level of quality than the stuff we have for all the other levels in the game. So therefore, we just have to kind of stick with what we have that's already been built in Dundee. And, if you can try and work with the team to add some of that polish and some of those concepts and ideas into the work that already exists, then that would be great. We'll make it slightly better, but we can't tear it all out and put all this new stuff in. So it was a bit disappointing because the work that I'd done for the title was, you just didn't see work like this in sprites at the time. I was doing things like motion blur and, that all has to be cooked into the animation and lighting so that when a character, one of the tiny characters would run around the world, and I'd made the characters a little bit larger than they appeared in the shipping game so I could get a lot more motion fidelity on their running cycles and, weapons and things. And, so when an enemy would run around the world and fire a weapon, for one frame, you would see this big muzzle flash. But then you would also see the muzzle flash on the character because it would flash and illuminate their body and clothing and so on. And it would also create kind of a back shadow. So the kind of bright flash at the front of the character where the muzzle flash was would create a very stark shadow behind the character for that frame that the muzzle flash illuminated. So it really kind of attached the characters to the terrain in a very physicalized kind of way, which made them seem like they were really kind of part of this scene, and then you could see the characters even performing fine details like, cracking a gun open, ejecting a shell, loading a new shell into the breech, closing the breech, all these kind of things that made them a little bit more interesting too.
Do you still have any of those original graphics? It would be fascinating to see how that looked.
I think so. I have a box. I have a box archive from my parents' house in Scotland, which contains, I guess, maybe 100 3.5-inch floppy disks. And it's basically an archive I did before I left Scotland of all of the work that I'd done. So it's probably in there somehow, but I don't have an Amiga anymore. So,
well, I've got one next to me if you need a hand.
We could ship them to you and see if you could revive them. But
yeah, definitely up for that.
Yeah, I went on with DMA to do a lot of very specialized work for DMA. Dave Jones was very interested in trying to see if they could kind of bring graphical work that was being generated in Dundee to some of the emerging standards that were coming out of Psygnosis at the time. And I'm sure as you're aware, Psygnosis was, synonymous with being the best people at creating graphics on the Amiga and the Atari and such. And they were using a lot of advanced technology to do that, silicon graphics, workstations and so on. So it was interesting to try to create some of these next generation effects for some of that test work for DMA. I did a lot of rotoscoping work, combining bitmap animation backgrounds with kind of rotoscope characters. So you had very fine character motion. Again, with kind of an Akira-like feel, you know, in terms of light and shadow and kind of observation of the characters' costumes and so on.
One thing about Walker I thought was very unique is the control scheme of it as well.
Yeah.
If I remember, you actually used the joystick and the mouse together to play the game. So
You could.
how did the team settle on this? And was there kind of any doubt that would work and confuse players?
You could use the joystick and mouse. Essentially, it was just sort of, you know, walk left and right. And you could use the mouse to control the walker's head. And one of the things that was very unique about it at the time was the fact that the walker's head could turn and move and look in 3D. So you could kind of move the mouse, which controlled the cursor that the walker's head was aiming at, anywhere in the play shield. So you could kind of aim in or out, left or right. And then you could push the mouse button to fire. And then the walker's head would look at the appropriate position, you know, in that aim grid, if you will, to then shoot the target appropriately. But it was very novel at the time because true three-dimensional graphics were very much an emerging thing, and they were not something that was greatly accessible to home computer users at the time. And I believe it was Scott Johnson who actually encoded and programmed a three-dimensional model of the walker's head. So he basically created the model of the walker's head completely, you know, as a set of three-dimensional points. They were not authored in a program, you know, like 3D Studio Max or something like that. And then he created a script that basically rotated the head and rendered it at various different aim grid angles, and then outputted that image as a bitmap. And this was very cutting edge work at the time. And that was really kind of the basis of Walker was, you know, hey, we have this kind of really cool Walker head thing looking around in 3D. What could we do with that? You know, how could we make that a game? And that was really kind of the origin of Walker.
So you actually led development on Walker 2, but it was cancelled after about a year of production. What's the story there? Yeah. And how far along was the production of the game?
Yes, I did lead that production. That was a lot of fun. We grew the team. We added a lot of people. At the time, our attention was sort of divided between trying to figure out, you know, the Sega Genesis was becoming really big at that time.
Yeah.
And we were like, you know, how can we... There was a lot of interest in porting Walker to the Sega Genesis, but it wasn't really something that was going to be particularly easy to do because Walker really relied on people having a mouse to play the game.
Yeah.
And the Sega just had the gamepad. So, you know, Ian Dunlop sort of messed around with that for a few months to see if we could kind of get something to work, but it just wasn't really working very well. While he was doing that, I was kind of ideating on, you know, what could Walker 2 look like? What would some of the features of the game be? There was a lot of areas of Walker's design that I was unhappy with, in the sense of... I thought the experience got very monotonous very quickly. You know, I would have liked to have seen more in the way of things like power-ups or more interesting enemies, you know, to fight. So those were things that I was very keen to solve for in Walker 2, and I spent a good deal of time with Ian working on ideas to make the enemies much more engaging and interesting to encounter and to take down. New sort of mechanical enemies. We also wanted to kind of have new kinds of boss battles. There was a lot of talk also at the time about using the newly emerging 3DO platform at the time, which was a big deal, especially because the 3DO platform had a compact disc. So there was a lot of room to store data there. So the early thinking was maybe we could, as opposed to creating Walker's backgrounds from a series of parallaxing bitmaps, maybe we could create the backgrounds as the 3D Studio Max models, and then have a camera rig moving on a dolly across the model scene, you know, to create the parallax movie output. So we would basically cook off the Walker's progression walking through the level as a movie, you know, using 3D Studio Max. And because we would be cooking off that background, it wouldn't be rendered in real time, which would mean that we could then produce backgrounds that had far more detail than was previously possible.
So why did the game end up getting cancelled then?
The game ended up getting cancelled largely because I left the company. I'd left the company at that time to come to America. I had met a woman at that time who I wanted to continue a relationship. She was an American lady, and she'd gone back to the States, and I wanted to continue that relationship. So I put my pencils down at DMA and travelled to America, and I have been there ever since.
It would have been interesting to see what you would have done with the sequel. 'Cause if I remember correctly, wasn't there some kind of platform sections that were cut from the original game? I remember seeing reviews at the time that there was a bit more in there that had to be taken out.
Yeah, the platform things were interesting. They were kind of a very, very late /11th hour ad by Ian to diversify the game experience. So again, there was a feeling that although Walker, was interesting and had some interesting ideas inside of the product, that there wasn't enough diversity and variety. So Ian had come up with this kind of little platforming game idea that maybe at the end of a level of Walker, you could get out the Walker, maybe enter some kind of bunker and engage in some sabotage activities or what have you. But it was kind of a little bit too little too late. It's a classic game development problem, right? You're trying to add a feature late in development, and unfortunately you have to come to the realization at a certain point that there's too much work that remains and not enough time, so it's like, what, much as we would love to get this in the game to add more variety, we just don't have time to finish this mode and make it good, so it just can't go in the game. And those are painful decisions when you have to make them,
Yeah.
Especially back then, because we didn't really know better, right? we were kind of teenagers in our early sort of 20s, and there wasn't really a lot of books or people who could tell us how to do these things. You were very much figuring out on your own.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you mentioned we were going to transition into your time at Iguana. So obviously you mentioned you moved with your partner to the United States. What's the story in terms of landing your project manager role then at Iguana Entertainment? So, was that a very similar experience to how you kind of got in with DMA? Were you looking in papers and stuff, or was it kind of like, did you set it up prior?
No, it was a very similar experience in that, again, looking in the back of gaming publications, gaming magazines, there would be adverts, for, hey, we need such and such. So again, I sent off a disc with examples of work. I was contacted by Jeff Spangenberg, who at that time was the president of Iguana Entertainment in California. They were, excited to talk to me because, I'd worked at DMA Design and had several published titles, under my belt at that time. They were in the process of moving their business from California to Austin, Texas. So he was curious as to whether I would be interested in joining the company and joining them in Texas. Being from Scotland at the time, I was like, wow, Texas, isn't that the place with, tumbleweeds blowing by and lots of cactuses? You have these sort of stereotypical visions of, what that might mean, which were mostly wrong, I might add. So I initially flew to Massachusetts, which is where my girlfriend at the time lived. We packed up her apartment into a U-Haul van and drove it down to Austin, Texas. And I took the job at Iguana. Initially, the job was kind of a project manager title, which is basically, in modern terms, would be a game director role. Lots of companies had lots of different names for those kinds of roles back in the day. But, you were basically the person who was in charge of the project, including scheduling. I mean, it's crazy to think of all the different responsibilities you had back then, but also responsible for, obviously the graphics, art direction, assembling levels, working with the programmers to code features, enemy behaviors, player character behaviors, things like that.
So how did you find the culture differed? I mean, coming from, Dundee to Texas, I mean, that must have been quite the change. And was there a different feel and vibe at Iguana compared to DMA? How did the experience differ?
The main difference is kind of just being in Texas, where God, it's so hot here. It can easily get up to 110 degrees. So, extremely hot. But in terms of culture, I think the main difference would be Iguana's culture was certainly more focused around productivity, and getting things done on schedules. There was only a certain amount of time that projects were financed through, so we had to kind of, deliver products on time and on schedule. Whereas at DMA Design, there was a little bit more leeway around timing. You had a little bit more time to kind of fiddle with things, which was both a good and a bad thing, right? It's good in the sense that everyone likes to tinker and deliver their best work. But the downside was that sometimes, tinkering could go on probably objectively a bit too long, sometimes maybe to the detriment of the product. So coming to Iguana was, I wouldn't say a shock, but, there was certainly more onus. This is a company, we make products, we have to deliver on time. So there was more of an emphasis on getting things done, in a reliable, predictable way. Whereas at DMA, things were a little bit more relaxed.
So your first game at Iguana was Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel, which was actually a Sunsoft IP. I think that was a sequel to Aero the Acrobat, or a spiritual successor. But how involved were you in its kind of like design and art, or was it like Sunsoft have said this is how it needs to be?
That's a good question. It was a very interesting situation. So David Siller was the creator of Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel. His son, in fact, was the creator of that character. And David, I believe, had created Aero the Acrobat. So we basically had a producer at Sunsoft who was David Siller, whose son was very interested in video games, who had created these characters. And they wanted to make this Zero the Kamikaze Squirrel game. So I was basically given a bunch of illustrations by David's son as to what this character, might look like. There was a very simple sort of half-page sort of story synopsis. It was all a bit sort of loosey-goosey because, his son was just a child at the time. And kind of I was asked to kind of synergize and synthesize this into like, okay, create a game proposal. So with, a couple of drawings of these characters and a loose story synopsis, I went away and crafted a design specification, a proposal, as to, okay, here's how this story connects together in a series of levels. Here are the enemies, here are their behaviors, here's the behavior of the Zero character, here's the different moves he can do, here's some of the things the aspects of how he moves that make him an interesting and unique character, at that era in gaming.
Well, you also did design work on the 32-bit version of Batman Forever, and that version's very different to the 16-bit games.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of people regard that as a bit of a hidden gem, actually. So give us a bit of background on that version.
Yeah,
of the game.
that was a really interesting project. A few years after working on Zero and, a few others, Sega Genesis, SNES products, Jeff Spangenberg came through to me one day and he's like, hey, do you like Batman? And I'm like, who doesn't like Batman? I'm like, yeah, of course I like Batman. He's like, well, we might be able to do a Batman game. Would you be interested in working on that? And I was like, hell yeah. So this was a very exciting prospect. And at the time, Acclaim was interesting in kind of divesting their interests from home games, which might be original titles, but also might be ports, right? So, they did things like ports of NBA Jam.
Yeah.
So they were very curious with how can we make arcade games ourselves, which we will then own, which will then make it easier for us to make proprietary ports. And they wanted to make this Batman Forever coin-op game, which was using somewhat experimental Sega hardware called the Sega Titan arcade system, which was basically a very powerful Sega Saturn. And this was all before the Sega Saturn had reached the marketplace. Consumers didn't know about it. So it was kind of like a beefed up Sega Saturn, which also had a proprietary soundboard on it, so it could produce very, very high fidelity audio. And it was a really interesting project because we were given early versions of the script of the film, and I was given a lot of concept art from Warner Brothers to try to create a game proposal with. But the movie was still in development at the time, and there was a lot of changes going on with the movie. So the tricky part was we would find that by the time we'd created a specification for the game, which would kind of call out, okay, here's the different levels, the different characters and situations. We would get a revised script from Warner Brothers, and it's like, oh, the movie's completely changed. now we need to totally change. This level in the game is gone. This character doesn't exist. So we'd have to kind of do major brain surgery.
Yeah.
On our pitch to kind of get it working again. But it was interesting because where we ended up was creating a kind of Streets of Rage kind of game, like a side-scrolling kind of beat 'em up, but we wanted to incorporate advanced fighting mechanics, the similar mechanics to what you would see in things like Killer Instinct. And we also wanted to have kind of a next generation of graphical fidelity. So it's interesting how this is actually a callback to the Walker 2 thing. So we did use 3D Studio Max to create these extremely detailed three-dimensional backgrounds that we then cooked off as bitmap images, so that the backgrounds to the game, had really nice kind of truly calculated shadows and reflections and lighting effects and things like that. And doing that level of work that time in the industry back then, it was very difficult because we were really pushing these machines, these PCs, to their limits. They would often crash. I think we had one explode one time because, they were really kind of being pushed to their limits in terms of rendering and memory constraints. And then we also had the characters in the game were modeled by Cyrus Lum, who was a very well-known sort of personality in gaming at the time, who was very expert in creating three-dimensional characters on SGI workstations. So he created Batman and Robin and all of the enemy characters, as well as another team of artists that we had that made these characters on these SGI workstations. And then they would kind of animate the characters and then cook those animations off and bring them over to the Sega Titan hardware.
So let's talk about the legendary South Park games that you worked on. Were you a fan of the show when the deal was made with Iguana, when it kind of like landed on your desk?
Yes. I don't think anyone wasn't a fan of the show back then because it was so new. The only thing that people had really seen of it was the sort of bootleg cartoon, The Spirit of Christmas, which was the kind of leaked cartoon where Santa beat up Jesus, and it was all very controversial and hilarious at the time. And so everyone was, at Acclaim at the time was just like, oh my God, what is this thing? It's hilarious. The senior executives of Acclaim were quite savvy as it came to sort of emerging brands, if you will, and they saw this cartoon and they were like, there's probably some money that could be made out of this. So they approached Casa Bonita, I should say Matt and Trey at the time, to sort of buy their rights to use the South Park characters for entertainment products. Initially, that came in the form of a PC screensaver pack. It was the quickest thing they could get to market. It was just like, hey, here's some animated interactive desktops with, South Park, elements. And they got that to market very quickly because it was a very technologically shallow, easy to implement product. And then from there, they were interested in making games. So, at that point, Jeff spoke to me, and he's like, hey, we've got the South Park thing, would you be interested in working on the South Park game? And I was like, hell yeah, that sounds great. The major challenge, though, was they wanted the product for Christmas of that year. And I think we were having that conversation in maybe March, early April, which meant that we only had months, basically, to design, build, and execute and deliver the product, which was insane, right? Doing anything in such a short time is just incredibly difficult. So we looked at kind of what we had, and at that time we only really had the Turok engine, which was a first-person shooter engine. Turok obviously being the game where you run around shooting dinosaurs, which was a big deal on the Nintendo 64. So we were like, okay, well, it's going to have to be a first-person shooter of some sort. We looked at the reference material because the show had started to air on Comedy Central at that time. I believe there were maybe 3 or 4 episodes in. There was not a lot of episodes for us to refer to. But there was this one episode in the early season where the kids went hunting with their Uncle Jimbo, and it was like, oh, look, it's a bear, it's coming right at me, blam. And we're like, okay, well, the kids, we can see them in the show here with, guns and things like that. So having them running around with guns should be fine. And, we were running this stuff up the flagpole with Comedy Central and Casa Bonita, which was the studio name for the South Park studio. Everyone was happy at that time. And then Columbine happened. And when Columbine happened, everyone was obviously completely stunned and shocked. But there came down word from Comedy Central that they're like, hey, we cannot have a game with children with guns in it. And we understood, this, but we were like, well, what do we do now? Because, we have a first person engine. Well, I mean, yeah. we don't have a lot of room to maneuver here. And I remember talking to the team and my leads at the time and being like, shit, we are really in a tight spot here. Set creativity knob to maximum. How are we going to get out of this problem? So we thought about it for some time, and basically this idea was floated that, well, instead of having the kids, holding different guns and actual weapons, maybe we could have them hold sort of cheeky toy-like equivalents. So instead of having a pistol, we could have a character holding a snowball. And, instead of the secondary fire on a pistol being, burst shot, for example, the secondary fire on the snowball could be a yellow snowball, that does more damage. Or we could have things like, Terrence and Philip fart dolls, which are essentially grenades. You sort of throw them in the world, they explode in a cloud of fart gas, but they're still a grenade, they're area of effect, damaging. So we basically substituted all of the different weapons that we had in the design with kind of toy equivalents. And then I went back to Comedy Central to meet with them in New York and to meet with Matt and Trey in LA. And I had to pitch them, like, here's how we think we're going to fix this and move forward. What do you guys think? And very fortunately for us, Comedy Central and Casa Bonita were all super happy with the workaround. They're like, this is really a great workaround. Let's just continue to move forward. So we had to scramble to continue the production of the game. It was an incredibly challenging project to deliver because of the short timeline. I believe we had about 9 months to make the game. And back then, cartridges were burned in Japan. So, it's not like, oh, we finished the game, put it on Steam. Like none of that stuff existed. So, you had to send the code to Nintendo. It had to be validated and, quality assured. And then that code had to be sent to Japan, where it was burned onto ROMs, and then they had to be loaded onto ships, and those ships had to cross the ocean. So there was a lot of pressure to get that stuff done. And Matt and Trey were also very involved in, at that time, towards the late stage production of the game in South Park the movie. So, I would be sitting in Austin writing the script, all the dialogue for the VO for the South Park game, the first one, and then I had to kind of beg them to give us some studio time to do all the voices, so that they could provide all the voices of the characters for all the lines we needed in the game, because the game had a lot of dialogue in it for a cartridge product. I mean, a huge amount of dialogue. And that was very difficult to get them scheduled with their commitments for the movie and the TV show as well. But we did manage to do it. So the team at Acclaim, it's definitely one of the teams I'm most proud to have worked with, because that project was very, very challenging for many different reasons. And the team, granted, the game is not the most complex game in the world, but the team still did an amazing job, given the time they had and the amount of game there is in the game. There's many levels, many different characters. There's even a multiplayer part of the game where you can play split screen. So there was a lot of value there for fans.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously a massive franchise, South Park.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the biggest thing in the world then, when it first came out. I remember first watching it on TV, like, what the hell is this? And then after a couple of episodes, you're like, oh my God, this is the funniest thing I've ever seen. So having a game of it was incredible. And I mean, it was on several different platforms. When PlayStation, you had the PC version deeply impacted, and it sounds like N64 then was that kind of the primary platform. So I know that's generally regarded as like the best version of it on there.
But it was certainly the primary SKU. it was only after we'd shipped on N64 that, our attention then turned to porting it to PC and such. I'm sure back then the PC folks were, like, yeah, but it runs better on our rigs, because they had graphics cards and things like that,
They always do.
But it was initially for the Nintendo 64.
So you also worked on Chef's Love Shack as well, which is a bit of a lesser-known title maybe in the UK. Tell us a bit about that then and what you worked on that game.
So the subsequent South Park projects, Chef's Love Shack, South Park Rally, I'm trying to remember if there was another one. Basically, I served as kind of an executive producer on those titles, so I wasn't really involved in the design of those products. We had a team in Austin. Chef's Love Shack was designed and project driven by Jules Watson, and the Rally product, I believe, was made in Australia. And my involvement in those games was to basically act as a consistent liaison between Iguana Entertainment, Comedy Central in New York, and Casa Bonita in LA, because I'd basically developed a relationship with the folks at those two different companies that we had to work with. And at the end of Deeply Impacted, Larry Lieberman at Comedy Central and the folks at Casa Bonita had said, hey, can you just stay on, even though you're not actually making these games? Can you stay on as our kind of point person to liaise with, on these projects? So I would work with Jules and the other teams, to present the work in progress of these titles to Comedy Central and Casa Bonita, to get feedback from them as to, what they were seeing, what they liked and didn't like in the games, where they wanted to see changes and so on. One of the great things there was that Matt and Trey were very avid gamers themselves, so that made it much easier to have conversations around gaming features because, they could cite precedent or comparative analysis of, hey, could we do it like this game, So that was very, very helpful.
So obviously with South Park Rally, I say obviously, Matt and Trey have kind of criticised the concept of the game before. And sometimes they kind of go on record to say, like, with the newer South Park games, they look back at mistakes that were made with the old games and decisions they made with the old games. But then in other interviews, they say they had nothing to do with those games. So how hands-on were they really with it? Like, with kind of like the demos of the game and the prototypes and stuff.
Yeah, they weren't really particularly hands-on with those works. They did see those works on several occasions, because I would have to present those works to them for feedback. But there was an acknowledgement and an understanding, I think, within Acclaim at that time that, especially the Rally game, that there was something just not quite right about the product. That although the idea of, obviously, people knew what Mario Kart was back then and it was a successful franchise. So, you would think that, hey, having the kids in karts, doing races or in tracks is a slam dunk, right? But one of the things that I believe was odd about the Rally game was this idea that the folks who were designing it had, that the track would contain branches within the track, which could then contain shortcuts, which could lead people to kind of developing different routes around the track to get a better lap time. And this is an interesting concept, but it didn't really play out too well in the game because people would race around the tracks and sort of be a bit confused as to, well, should I be going left, right, or center here? And because different players were going in different branched paths, it meant you saw each other less, which meant the sense of rivalry was weaker because you didn't see, you weren't always kind of chasing the pack, in the pack, or leading the pack. So there was a number of rather odd design decisions made in the Rally game that made it a bit of an odd fish. And it was something that I had concerns with, but that, my job at that time was not to, I suppose, interfere with that as much as to just, show Matt and Trey and Comedy Central the works in progress, talk to them about what changes could be made and gather their feedback. So I do feel for Matt and Trey on that one that the game was not, I don't think, of sufficient quality to attach the brand to. So I understand, why they would be upset with that one.
Well, I mean, as well as making the South Park games, you're also senior designer on some of the Turok games as well. So how did you manage to juggle so many projects at once then? You must have been kind of spinning a lot of plates at that time.
Sometimes, I mean, it would my time would be sort of divided, right? So, a certain amount of my time would be involved with communicating with Comedy Central and Casa Bonita via conventional methods, via email, telephone, things like that. And then some of the time, you had to kind of get on the plane. So, usually once a month, sometimes once every 6 weeks, I would get on the plane and fly to New York, meet with Larry and Comedy Central people, then fly over to LA, meet with Matt and Trey, and then come back to Austin and give the team any direction, or any sort of findings from those sessions. And then in between, doing that, I would still have, about half of my week left, right? So that would be time that I could help on other projects. So, for example, one of the projects that I was juggling at that time was Turok Rage Wars, which was being led by Mark Pacini. Mark would later on leave Acclaim and go to work on Metroid Prime, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. Great game. So Mark was leading Turok Rage Wars, and I was helping him with that project in terms of just generally kind of helping him with bits and pieces of project management, but also building some levels, right? So I would go into the editor and, build some levels, because it was a kind of a multiplayer focused game. So we wanted to cram as many levels in there as we could. So really just, keeping busy, between sort of project management stuff, helping new project managers spin up, and contributing content, where needed.
I mean, obviously you've done a lot in your career, Neill, and kind of moving a bit more towards, the modern time. I know one project that you're particularly proud of, and you should be as well, because it's really, really impressive title, and I know was up for award nominations as well, was the virtual reality game, Torn, that you worked on in 2018. So kind of moving a bit more towards the recent years. Tell us kind of the story behind that game then, and kind of how your career led to that.
Yeah, that's an interest. Gosh, there's a lot to cover between Nintendo 64 and that. I don't think I can cover that gap quickly. But Torn was a very interesting product. In that it was entirely a new IP. We had a fixed budget of around about $1 million, which is not a lot of money to make a game with. And we had a very small team of around about 5 people. So the question was, what can we do that's compelling with such a small team, in a relatively small amount of time. And at that time, when looking at the virtual reality marketplace, and this was, very much when VR was just beginning to kind of blow up a bit, there was a sense from, developers as well as early consumers that VR was interesting, and you could do some interesting things with it, but that a lot of the experiences that people were seeing were very kind of shallow. They were almost like tech demos. Like, hey, there's a bunch of aliens flying around, you can shoot them, or here's a kind of, ping pong derivative, or, other things like that, and there was interest in how could, or could people make a virtual reality game that had a little bit more substance. And so this was something that we kind of looked at as possibly an opportunity to could we make a virtual reality game that had a little bit more sort of qualitative substance, was set in an interesting place, was not a tech demo, but that contained some interesting technology. And there was a technology that they'd shown a few years earlier that they'd worked on, which was a true kind of atomic fluid simulation. And what I mean by an atomic fluid simulation is normally in video games, water is just a sheet. If you're playing Grand Theft Auto and you're sitting on a boat or a jet ski, the water plane that your jet ski is sitting on is just like a blanket on your bed. It's just a kind of a flat sheet with vertexes kind of moving up and down to give the illusion of water. If you took a bucket and you put it in the ocean of GTA, you would not pull out a bucket which had water inside of it, because the water is not modeled at an atomic level. And these NVIDIA Flex simulations that NVIDIA had shown were simulations of true water, right? Water that collided and that had the characteristics of fluid. You could fill a bucket of it up and pour it out. And so one of the questions that I was curious about with the team was, could we make a anatomic fluid simulation work in virtual reality, and what would it be like in stereoscopic 3D to interact with such a simulation? And might there be something that we could learn from that, might lead to a game? So short answer to that was, yes, we could make it work in VR. It was extremely compelling to interact with. There was many different ways that we could use this fluid simulation. For example, you could do things like sculpting of clay. So you could have a big block of liquid atoms, in a rectangular form, that you could then use your virtual reality kind of hand-tracked controllers to kind of claw at the clay and kind of literally sculpt in real time, with your hands, using these atoms as kind of clay atoms. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that, and we wanted to make a game that had a narrative component. But because we had such a small budget, one of the determinations that I'd made early on in the creative solutioning for the game was, although we want to have a game with people in it, we cannot afford to see them, because we cannot afford to pay the budget of building a character mesh as well as a facial rig and doing rich facial motion capture so the face is, convincingly animated. It was just out of our budget. So how are we going to solve this? How are we going to have a game where people are talking to each other where we can't afford to render people? So it was a bit of a tricky problem. And that's kind of when I had this epiphany that, what if this fluid was the person? And then the next question became, well, why would that be? And that was really kind of the epiphany that drew Torn together. And Torn is basically the story about an urban explorer, this woman called Catherine Patterson, who stumbles across an abandoned mansion. And this mansion is very unlike anything she's seen previously in her prior sort of blog posts, because it has these kind of very bizarre, like Willy Wonka, like mechanical tentacles entering the house and exiting the property. And it's just a very bizarre sight. And she manages to find a way into to the mansion, where she encounters this thing called a speck, which is a kind of a tiny, bright sort of Tinkerbell-like light that can speak to her. And it kind of guides her through some of the onboarding parts of the game to find this tool and complete certain tasks. And when she completes some of these early game tasks, she's transported to kind of a parallel universe. And inside that parallel universe, she finds the disembodied mind of Dr. Talbot, who is the person who created the mansion with all these machines. And essentially his mind and his body have been torn apart, which is why the game's called Torn. And the players have to interact with this, what we call the Talbot blob, who kind of tells them the story, and then they return to the mansion, where they then complete various puzzles to advance the narrative, and then they return back to Dr. Talbot, where they then advance the story forward, and so on. So this fluid simulation essentially became one of the central narrative characters of the game. So it was a very fascinating project to work on, and it was our innovative use, I should say, of these technologies that got us that DICE nomination.
Well, Neill, it sounds like you're still, continuing to push the boundaries of technology, and, such a fascinating chat with you, and long may it continue, Neill. So thank you so much for coming on and being our special guest this week. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight. Thank you so much.